we beat those guys for 83 weeks straight. And they took that personally. Vince did. A lot of guys did.
Scott Steiner was one of wrestling's toughest stars, a man built like a tank, with a mouth that never stopped. But I only feared him points to the one man who stood above even his idea of toughness. Steiner spent years screaming at the world in wild interviews, ranting about maths, numbers, and anyone who crossed him. He built the Big Poppa Pump character out of pure rage and pure muscle. He looked like a man who feared nobody on earth. Yet behind the shouting, Steiner held a short list of wrestlers he truly respected, and one of those men made even the Steiner brothers doubt their own toughness. And as we count down the 10 men who earned that rare respect, use the hype button and give this video some hype if you enjoy stories from wrestling's wildest years. That list was never loud. It was quiet, personal, and hard to earn. So the real question is simple. How could a man famous for attacking so many of his peers still hold deep respect for a select few? We are not at that top name yet. First, we need to understand what respect meant to Scott Steiner at all. Steiner's respect was not handed out for free, and it was not random either. It followed a clear pattern. He valued people who were tough in a real fight. He valued strong amateur sports records. He valued loyalty that lasted through hard times. He valued people who protected his career and gave him room to be himself. He valued people who understood wrestling as a business, not just a show. He valued people who refused to bow to company bosses. These 10 names were never part of one official ranking that Scott announced himself. They are 10 men the research shows he consistently praised, feared, trusted, or treated with real respect across his long career. We will move through them from number 10 down to number 1, following the shape of his career from his college days all the way to his final years in the ring. It starts with the man who taught him what loyalty even meant. Number 10 on this list is Rick Steiner, and there is no better place to start, because Rick shaped almost everything about how Scott saw respect. Both brothers came from the tough amateur wrestling program at the University of Michigan. That is real sports wrestling, not the show business kind. Scott became an NCAA Division I All-American in 1986. Rick set a university record with a pin that took only 15 seconds. That background shaped how the brothers looked and worked once they turned professional. They wore college-style jackets and singlets in the ring. Their matches were full of hard throws and heavy suplexes. Fans had never quite seen a tag team work that way before, and it changed how tag team wrestling looked in the late 1980s and early 1990s. That amateur foundation stayed with both men for the rest of their careers, shaping how they trained, how they moved, and how they judged every other wrestler they ever stepped into a ring with. The Steiner brothers officially formed their team in January 1989. They quickly rose to the top, winning both the NWA World Tag Team Championship and the United States Tag Team Championship. Early in their run, they were managed by Missy Hyatt and later by Robin Green. Robin Green tripped Scott during a match at Clash of the Champions Viry. That moment turned her into the villain known as Woman, and she brought in a new team called Doom to feud with the brothers. Rick and Scott's bond was tested in a real way in 1991. WCW had started grooming Scott for a big singles push. He had a well-regarded time-limit draw with NWA World Champion Ric Flair at Clash of the Champions 14. That kind of match usually leads straight to a solo push. Scott had the chance to step out on his own and become a bigger individual star. Instead, he resisted a full move into singles wrestling. He did not want to leave Rick behind in the middle of the card while he climbed to the top alone. In December 1992, the brothers left WCW for the WWF. WCW executive Bill Watts had offered them poor terms on a new contract, so they walked. Once in the WWF, officials there also considered turning Scott into a singles star. One idea involved Scott winning the 1993 Royal Rumble. Another idea, even bigger, involved Scott actually wrestling his own brother Rick during that same Rumble match. Scott turned that pitch down flat. He later explained that his whole reason for getting into wrestling in the first place was to team with his brother and prove they were the best tag team in the world. That is not a small statement. He was choosing his brother over a path that could have made him a massive solo star years earlier than he eventually became one. The partnership did face a smaller setback in late 1992, when Rick tore a chest muscle. Scott had to work alone for a stretch. During that period, in October 1992, Scott teamed with Marcus Bagwell against Steve Austin and Brian Pillman. When Arn Anderson attacked Marcus backstage before the match, an angry Scott turned on his own hurt partner. He kicked Marcus and shoved him into the ring to be pinned. It was an early flash of the aggression that would later define the Big Poppa Pump character. The full on-screen breakup of the Steiner brothers as a team did not actually happen until 1998, years later. Praise Rick first, because turning down a massive singles push to stay with him is one of the clearest examples of pure loyalty in Scott's entire career. Not many performers would give up that kind of opportunity for a family member. It says something good about him, but look closer, and the story gets more complicated. Scott's whole idea of respect began with someone who shared his blood, his sports background, his hard-hitting style, and his rise to the top. In other words, the standard was personal from the very start. It was never abstract. It was built around one specific person he already loved and trusted before he ever stepped into a ring. The research does not prove that Scott was scared to go solo, and it would be unfair to say that. A fairer reading is that he rejected big opportunities because his own code, built around loyalty to Rick, mattered more to him than the company's bigger plans. Those plans might have made him a bigger star sooner. He said no anyway. That single choice, made more than once across several years, tells us more about Scott's real priorities than almost anything he ever said in an interview. It is worth remembering how the brothers first rose together too. Their partnership was never a shortcut to fame. It was built on years of shared amateur training long before either man ever stepped into a professional ring, and that shared history gave their bond a depth that most tag teams simply never had. From family loyalty, the story moves to a very different kind of respect. It is respect for a wrestler who stayed calm and clean while the business around him turned into a mess of backstage fighting. Number 9 is Sting, and his story shows a real gap between what Scott admired and how Scott himself actually behaved. WCW in the late 1990s was full of backstage fighting. Big stars fought over power, creative control, and their spot on the card. Sting mostly stayed out of it. He became known as the emotional center of WCW, the one steady figure while everyone else pushed and shoved for position. Steiner praised him for that. He praised Sting's professionalism, his leadership, his work rate, and his focus on the wrestling itself rather than backstage games. Sting's road to the top started far from WCW. He began in a promotion called the Continental Wrestling Association, using the name Flash. He teamed with a young Jim Hellwig, the man who later became the Ultimate Warrior, and together they were called the Freedom Fighters. Later they moved to Bill Watts's Universal Wrestling Federation and became the Blade Runners. Sting won the UWF Tag Team Championship alongside Rick Steiner in 1987. That match created an early link between Sting and the whole Steiner family, long before Scott and Sting became linked in fans' minds. It is easy to forget just how early that connection started, years before either man became a household name in WCW. That connection grew stronger in May 1991, when the Steiner brothers faced Sting and Lex Luger at Super Brawl 1. The match won Pro Wrestling Illustrated's Match of the Year. It was proof that Sting belonged in the same conversation as Scott when it came to pure in-ring ability. Sting later changed his whole look. He had been the bright, colorful surfer Sting for years. In late 1996, he became the quiet, dark Crow character instead. The research says the real sadness visible on his face during the summer of 1998 was not only acting, it reflected genuine health and personal struggles he was going through at the time. Sadly, people backstage did not always understand that. At Starrcade 1997, Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff questioned whether Sting was even ready to win the world title, using comments about his appearance and condition to make their point. It was not a kind moment. Despite all of that, Steiner's respect for Sting never wavered. Years later, in 2008, they worked together in TNA as leading members of a group called the Main Event Mafia. Sting later revived a heroic version of that same group in 2013 to fight against a villain group called Aces and Eights. Here is the irony worth sitting with. Steiner admired Sting for staying out of backstage politics and avoiding public fights. Yet Steiner himself became famous for the opposite. He was known for loud public attacks, open disputes, and heated confrontations throughout his career. The two men could not have looked more different behind the scenes, even while Steiner clearly respected what Sting represented. That does not mean Steiner caused every political problem in WCW. That would not be fair, and the research does not support it. It simply means his public image was strikingly different from Sting's calm reputation. The pattern suggests that Sting may have represented something Steiner did not often show in himself, a kind of self-control and quiet focus that stayed steady no matter what chaos surrounded him. None of this should make Sting look bad. If anything, this section makes him look better by comparison. He is one of the clearest positive figures in Scott's entire circle of respect. Even during the years when WCW felt like a battlefield of egos, Sting kept showing up and doing his job, and that steadiness is exactly what Scott seemed to admire most about him. From Sting's calm conduct, the story turns to a wrestler whose career path looked strikingly similar to Scott's own, right down to the brother by his side, and the danger that came with their matches together. Number 8 is Booker T, a man whose career followed a path so close to Scott's own that the respect almost writes itself. and yet the story still cuts both ways. Both men rose through hard, physical tag team wrestling before ever getting the chance to prove themselves alone, and both men carried that early training into everything they did afterward. Both men first became famous as part of a tag team alongside a brother. Scott had Rick and the Steiner brothers. Booker had Stevie Ray in a team called Harlem Heat. Both men later climbed all the way to becoming WCW World Heavyweight Champions on their own. Harlem Heat arrived in WCW in June 1993. At first, Booker and Stevie Ray used the names Cole and Kane. Their early act was built around a prison theme, managed by a character called Cole Rob Parker. It was not a flattering start. They later dropped that gimmick, gained a manager named Sister Sherry, and finally used their real names, Booker T and Stevie Ray, going forward. That change gave both men the room to build real careers under their own identities, rather than a gimmick that never truly fit them. Booker's own life gave him a kind of credibility that could not be faked. He grew up in the South Park area of Houston, the youngest of 8 children. Both of his parents died by the time he was 14 years old. He faced real trouble with the law before Stevie Ray helped steer him toward professional wrestling instead. That is a hard road, and it explains a lot about why other wrestlers, including Scott, took him seriously as a person and not just as a performer. Booker proved his skill as a singles competitor during a famous best-of-7 series against Chris Benoit in 1998. Those matches showed he could carry a major singles feud on his own, not just as part of a team. In a much lighter moment, Scott and Booker appeared together on the Disney Channel program The Jersey in March 2001, in an episode where 2 fighting teenagers magically entered the bodies of the 2 wrestlers during a press conference. Their real matches, though, were never soft. At WCW Mayhem 2000, Scott beat Booker in a brutal caged heat match for the World Heavyweight Championship. The match caused real injuries that left Booker out of action for a period afterward. Despite that, Steiner respected Booker's athletic talent and his serious, no-nonsense attitude in the ring. Years later, they teamed up again in TNA as members of the Main Event Mafia, and together they won tag team gold. Here is where the negative angle comes in clearly. Scott admired Booker as an athlete and as a serious professional, yet their hard-fought match left Booker genuinely hurt. That single detail supports a wider pattern running through this whole list. Steiner often measured respect through toughness, through the willingness to survive rough, punishing matches rather than avoid them. To be fair to Scott, the research does not say he meant to injure Booker on purpose. It only says the match caused real injuries. There is a difference between a dangerously hard style and a deliberate attempt to hurt someone, and the story should not blur that line. Booker's difficult childhood deserves care here too. It should not be treated as cheap drama or used only to shock. His early life gave him a clear kind of toughness and seriousness that Scott clearly noticed and respected in him. That kind of respect is not built overnight. It comes from years of working alongside someone and watching how they carry themselves when the cameras are not even rolling. Booker could take a hard match and survive it. The next man on this list was placed in a completely different class. He was not simply tough for professional wrestling. He was feared for what he could do in a real fight. No cameras and no script involved at all. Number 7 is Haku, also known in WCW as Meng, and this is the man behind the words "I only feared him." Professional wrestling matches are planned in advance, but backstage in the older days, rank often came from something much more real. Haku held a near-mythical place in that world, as the most genuinely dangerous man in the entire business. Scott Steiner had his own reputation as a powerful, unpredictable, and frightening man in his own right. Wrestlers and promoters often avoided crossing him, and yet even Scott showed deep, quiet respect for Haku's raw physical power, a respect built not on rumor alone, but on stories that came directly from people who had seen it with their own eyes. Haku trained in sumo wrestling back in Japan. Stories passed down by other wrestlers describe his use of brutal, real-world fighting tactics whenever things turned serious. In 1987, Haku got into a real fight with Jesse Barr, a wrestler known as Jimmy Jack Funk. The fight nearly cost Barr his eye. That single story alone was enough to cement Haku's reputation as a man nobody wanted to test. Another story involves Brutus Beefcake. Beefcake had complained to WWF management that Haku was hitting him too hard during their matches. Haku did not go to management about it. He confronted Beefcake directly in the locker room showers, choked him, and lifted his entire body off the ground, while other wrestlers stood frozen, too afraid to step in and help. It reportedly took Hulk Hogan himself to calm the situation down. Even top executives were not safe from Haku's protective instincts. Eric Bischoff and referee Greg Gagne once interrupted a private conversation involving Haku, Chris Candido, Tammy Sitch, and Chris Jericho. Haku demanded that both men apologize to his friends on the spot. According to the story, Bischoff and Gagne did exactly that, without argument. Then there is the story the Steiner brothers witnessed for themselves. While out one night with fellow wrestlers Kurt Hennig and Rick Rude, Haku tried to break up a bar fight and ended up detained by police. According to the account, officers used strong chemical spray to try to subdue him. Haku did not react the way anyone expected. He was said to have opened his mouth and closed his eyes, almost as if breathing the spray in on purpose. He then broke free of his handcuffs and fought off several officers at once, with some versions of the story putting the number as high as 8. That night convinced both Scott and Rick Steiner that their college wrestling backgrounds, however impressive on paper, would not be enough to protect them if Haku ever turned that kind of force on them. Years later, wrestler Perry Saturn was asked in a U-Shoot interview who would win in a real fight among several of WCW's toughest men, a list that included Scott Norton, Fit Finlay, Jim Duggan, Rick Steiner, Scott Steiner, and Saturn himself. Saturn did not hesitate. He picked Tonga, meaning Haku, and said plainly that nobody else on that list would stand a chance against him. These are not stories to laugh about. Real violence, real fear, and real injury sit at the center of them, and the wrestling culture of that era often treated stories like these as simple proof of rank, rather than something troubling. The pattern suggests something uncomfortable about Scott's whole code of respect. At times, it was not built only around safe competition, honest skill, or steady leadership. It was also built around who could walk into a room and make grown men afraid without saying a single word. That is a hard thing to sit with, especially for a man who otherwise valued discipline and real athletic achievement above almost everything else. This is where the thumbnail promise finally pays off. "I only feared him" is not a confirmed word-for-word quotation from Scott himself. It is the theme of this whole story, and Haku is the clearest answer the research provides. He is the one man whose raw, uncontrollable force made even 2 decorated college wrestlers doubt their own ability to survive against him. None of this should make Scott look weak. In fact, the point only lands because Scott himself had a genuine amateur wrestling background and a fearsome reputation of his own. It takes a very serious level of toughness to recognize someone who stands even further beyond that line, and to admit it, even only through his actions rather than his words. Scott never needed to say the words out loud. His behavior around Haku, and the way other wrestlers described that behavior years later, said everything that needed saying. From raw, physical fear, the story now shifts toward a very different kind of protection. The next man on this list did not earn Scott's respect by frightening him. He earned it by helping keep Scott's entire career valuable and protected for years. Number 6 is Jeff Jarrett, and this relationship shows genuine friendship mixed with clear professional benefit for both men. Scott and Jeff grew close during WCW's final year, when both men worked as leading villains on the roster. Jarrett came from wrestling royalty. His father, Jerry Jarrett, was a well-known Southern promoter, so Jeff grew up around the business his whole life. In 2002, Jeff co-founded a new promotion called TNA, designed as an alternative during a period when WWE controlled almost the entire industry. Jarrett also worked for AAA down in Mexico, and later joined the Bullet Club faction in New Japan Pro Wrestling. After that, he formed a company called Global Force Wrestling, alongside a producer named David Broom. Throughout their years working together, Jarrett repeatedly booked, protected, and gave creative freedom to Steiner. He understood the value of Scott's larger-than-life personality and his unfiltered, unpredictable interviews, and he made sure Scott had the room to be exactly who he was on screen. That kind of support is not something every promoter offers a difficult, outspoken performer, and it explains a great deal about why the friendship lasted as long as it did. Steiner returned that loyalty in a very direct way. In 2009, he confronted TNA president Dixie Carter over her decision to sign Hulk Hogan to the company. He warned her plainly that Hogan could put TNA out of business entirely. That warning reflected real frustration Steiner felt about how Carter was running the promotion. The research also links some of that anger to her continued trust in a producer named Vince Russo, whose choices had upset parts of TNA's audience and its own wrestling staff. Jarrett and Steiner stayed close through all of it, across WCW, TNA, and their later work connected to Global Force Wrestling. Here is the skeptical question worth asking. Scott's respect for Jarrett cannot really be separated from the fact that Jarrett gave him steady work, protection, and creative freedom for years. That does not make the friendship fake. The research clearly describes a real, lasting bond between the two men, not a business arrangement dressed up as friendship. Still, it is fair to ask whether Scott respected Jarrett purely as a person, or partly because Jarrett understood exactly how to keep Scott useful, protected, and happy within the business. The honest answer is probably both at once, and that is worth sitting with rather than brushing aside. This is interpretation, not proven fact, and it should be treated that way. It also fits neatly into the wider pattern seen with Rick Steiner. Scott's deepest loyalty often went to people who had a direct, personal stake in his own success. On the Hogan warning itself, It is worth being careful. The research only tells us what Scott believed and what he said to Dixie Carter at the time. It does not tell us what happened to TNA afterward, and this story should not be used to prove Scott right or wrong about anything that came later. What it does show clearly is how far Scott was willing to go, publicly and directly, to protect a business relationship and a friendship he clearly valued. From a promoter who protected Scott's career, the story now turns to a wrestler who believed the smartest path in the business was the one that paid the most money while causing the least damage to his own body. Number 5 is Kevin Nash, and his story shows Scott's respect for smart business thinking, set right beside the heavy physical price Scott paid in his own career. Before Nash became a major star, WCW gave him a string of weak, forgettable characters. He appeared as Steel in a group called the Master Blasters, complete with an orange mohawk. He later played a silver-haired character called Oz. Before that, he was even known as Vinny Vegas. None of those characters clicked with fans. Everything changed when Nash moved to the WWF and became Diesel. He won the promotion's Triple Crown and held the WWF Championship for 358 days, a very long reign by any standard. He was also part of a powerful backstage group of friends known as the Clique. Alongside his close friend Scott Hall, Nash used the intense competition of the Monday Night Wars to help wrestlers gain guaranteed contracts from WCW, something that changed how the whole industry paid its top stars from that point forward. That single shift in how contracts worked reshaped the business for everyone who came after, not only for Nash himself. Nash's whole philosophy could be summed up simply. He believed that only two things in wrestling were truly real: the money and the miles. He built his in-ring style around a small, effective set of moves rather than constant physical risk. The research lists elbows, a boot choke, a side slam, a move called snake eyes, and a powerbomb as his main tools. His goal was to stay effective in the ring while protecting his body as much as possible over a long career. Scott, by contrast, had suffered heavy physical damage throughout his own career because of his hard-hitting, high-risk style. He still respected Nash's honest, open approach to money, travel, and physical wear. Their friendship lasted for years, through WCW, through TNA, and later through independent wrestling shows. When Scott opened a Shoney's restaurant in Ackworth, Georgia, Nash showed up to support him, along with Scott Hall, Jeff Jarrett, and Rick Steiner. Now look at the contrast a little closer. Scott respected Nash for learning how to make good money without wrecking his own body in the process. There is real irony sitting inside that respect. Scott's own early style depended on hard suplexes, huge amounts of force, and constant physical risk that eventually caught up with him. He admired in Nash exactly the kind of caution he never really practiced himself. To be fair, nothing here suggests Nash was lazy or avoided real work. The research frames his approach as smart self-preservation, not laziness. The wider point is simply that Steiner's respect stretched to cover people who understood how to use the system wisely, not only people who gave absolutely everything physically, night after night. It takes a certain kind of confidence to build a whole career around doing less in the ring, while still staying at the very top of the card. This also complicates the picture built earlier around Haku. Scott respected one man for frightening, uncontrolled physical force, and he respected another man entirely for carefully avoiding unnecessary physical damage. His code, it turns out, was flexible enough to bend toward whichever quality he happened to admire most in each individual case. From a friend who knew how to protect his own body and his own paycheck, the story now turns to a much messier friendship, one built on loyalty that somehow survived real fights, bad decisions, and constant backstage trouble. Number 4 is Buff Bagwell, and this section shows that plain personal loyalty sometimes mattered more to Scott than clean professional behavior. WCW paired Scott and Buff together as a tag team within the NWO, and their on-screen chemistry worked well right from the start. Buff had first found success alongside Scotty Riggs in a team called the American Males. He later built an arrogant, flashy villain character that fit perfectly beside Scott's own Big Poppa Pump persona. Their partnership on screen turned into a real friendship off-screen as well, the kind of bond that outlasted storylines, title runs, and eventually, the entire promotion they had both grown up in. That friendship was tested in strange ways. In 1999, Scott and Buff wrestled a match that became very hard and unprofessional. According to the story, Scott genuinely attacked Buff for real during parts of that match, going well beyond what any script called for. Rick Steiner later turned on Buff during the match itself, and helped his brother win. Buff carried a rough backstage reputation of his own. He was arrested at one point after attacking a stage worker who had simply asked him to move away from an exit. He later offered a very different explanation, claiming he had been defending Miss Elizabeth. Buff also witnessed one of the most famous backstage fights in Scott's career, the confrontation between Scott and Diamond Dallas Page. That fight followed an unscripted insult Scott made about Page's wife, Kimberly. Scott took Page down during the real fight and reportedly tried to damage his eye. Buff and fellow wrestler Lash LaRue both witnessed the incident. Buff's short run in WWE during 2001 ended almost as quickly as it began. He arrived late to television tapings and got into a real backstage fight with Shane Helms, who struck him with a frozen bottle of water during the argument. Through all of that trouble, Scott still remained Buff's friend. Buff later showed up to support Scott's restaurant opening, and the two men worked together on independent wrestling shows long after WCW had closed its doors for good. From a chaotic but lasting friendship, the story now turns to the clearest example of Scott using his own fame to lift up a younger wrestler still trying to make his name in the business. Number 3 is Kurt Angle, and this is one of the clearest cases of pure athletic respect in Scott's entire career, though it comes with a heavy physical cost attached. Scott's TNA years eventually brought him face-to-face with an athlete whose amateur record was even stronger than his own. Scott had been an NCAA Division I All-American at Michigan. Kurt Angle was a 2-time NCAA Division I heavyweight champion, and he went even further by winning freestyle wrestling gold at the 1996 Olympic Games. That kind of record was almost impossible for Scott to dismiss. Two decorated amateur wrestlers meeting inside a professional ring created a rare kind of match, one built on real credentials rather than only showmanship. Angle's road to Olympic gold involved real pain and real loss. He trained under a coach named Dave Schultz at a club called Foxcatcher. Schultz was murdered by the club's own sponsor, a man named John DuPont. Angle had to keep training somewhere else after that, carrying his coach's memory with him. During the Olympic trials, Angle suffered a serious neck injury, fracturing 2 bones in his neck and damaging nearby discs. He still competed at the Olympics itself, using pain-reducing injections to get through his matches, and he beat an Iranian wrestler named Abbas Jadidi to finally win his gold medal. Angle moved into professional wrestling in 1998 and picked up the craft at remarkable speed. Triple H once called him the fastest person he had ever seen learn the wrestling business. At WrestleMania 19, Angle worked a major, widely praised match against Brock Lesnar even though he badly needed neck surgery at the time. Triple H later told him plainly that he had raised the standard for everyone else in the company. That same hard style and those repeated neck injuries eventually led Angle into a serious struggle with Vicodin and other pain medication. This part of his story should never be treated lightly or used as a punchline. It was a real and serious result of years of real physical pain, the kind of cost that rarely shows up on a highlight reel, but stays with a performer long after the cameras stop rolling. From a world-famous Olympic athlete, the story now moves to a much smaller wrestler in TNA, a man who earned Scott's respect not through fear or Olympic medals, but through steady effort, real skill, and a willingness to play along with Scott's larger-than-life character. It is a lighter note after 2 heavy, physical stories, and it shows a very different side of what Scott valued in the people around him. Number 2 is Petey Williams, and this section offers a lighter, warmer story before the list closes on its final and most surprising name. It is a welcome change of pace after the heavier stories that came before it. Petey was a leading member of TNA's X Division, a smaller and faster kind of wrestler than Scott had ever really worked with before. Petey began copying Scott's whole bodybuilding look and started calling himself Big Poppa Pump. On paper, that idea could easily have come across as mockery, aimed straight at Scott's image. Instead, Scott embraced the whole thing completely, and their pairing turned into a genuinely fun mentor and student story on screen. Both men ended up winning briefcases in a storyline called Feast or Fired. Scott put Petey through a series of physical tests along the way, almost like initiation rituals. Petey even shaved his own head at one point, to look more like his mentor. Outside the ring, Petey played guitar and harmonica in a band called The High Crusade, alongside fellow wrestlers Alex Shelley and Chris Sabin. From a fun, mentor-driven friendship, the story now turns to the most surprising name on this entire list. Unlike everyone before him, this final man never teamed with Scott and never wrestled him even once. Scott respected him for something else entirely. Number 1 is CM Punk, and he closes this list by showing that Scott's respect could cross entire generations and completely different wrestling styles when the right value was at stake. Punk and Scott came from very different eras of wrestling, and their in-ring styles barely resembled one another at all. What they shared was a loud, public dislike of WWE's power structure, and both men directed real anger toward Vince McMahon and Triple H over the years. Punk left WWE in January 2014. The research links his exit to real injuries, ongoing medical concerns, and deep creative frustration with the company. He had entered the 2014 Royal Rumble at number 1 and lasted an incredible 49 minutes before Kane finally eliminated him. Punk then walked straight up to McMahon and told him he was going home for good. According to the account, his bus driver later described just how deeply unhappy Punk had become by that point. The research also says WWE tried using his relationship with AJ Lee to convince him to come back. Scott praised Punk for having the courage to walk away entirely. He saw that choice as a genuine defense of Punk's own health and his own personal control over his career, rather than an act of weakness or failure. The research draws a direct comparison here to Scott's own exit from WWE back in 2004, which followed his own creative and political troubles at the time. Punk also had major creative input into the formation of a group called The Shield, which included Seth Rollins, Dean Ambrose, and Roman Reigns. After leaving wrestling behind, Punk moved into mixed martial arts and fought Mike Jackson at UFC 225. Scott viewed that kind of open defiance as a rare and real form of integrity in an industry built mostly around following orders. It takes a certain kind of nerve to walk away from guaranteed money and a huge platform simply because it no longer feels right, and Scott clearly recognized that nerve in Punk. This final name proves the point of the whole list. Scott did not need Punk to share his look, his size, his generation, or even his style in the ring. Punk stood up against company power, and for Scott, that alone was enough to earn real respect. The skeptical reading here is simple and fair. Scott's respect ran strongest when another wrestler confirmed something he already believed deeply himself: that company management could not always be trusted with a performer's health or their voice. It is a fitting note to end the list on, because it ties directly back to Scott's own long history of shoot interviews aimed straight at wrestling's biggest bosses. Put all 10 names together, side by side, and a picture starts to form. Scott Steiner's code of respect was narrow, and it was often centered on qualities that mattered to him personally, but it was never fake, and it was never random. His respect went to family, always the very first standard he ever learned. It went to real athletes with real records. It went to calm professionals, to tough fighters, to loyal friends, to smart business minds, to younger workers who earned his trust the hard way, and to rebels who stood up against company power just like he did. 10 very different men, coming from 10 very different corners of the wide wrestling world, all managed to reach that same rare place in Scott's mind. Some earned it through blood and shared history, some through fear, some through sheer skill, some through smart business sense, and some simply by standing beside him when it truly mattered most. Scott Steiner will always be remembered for the shouting, the chaos, and the wild image he built around himself over the years. The Big Poppa Pump persona that made him one of the most unforgettable characters wrestling has ever produced. But look past all of that noise, and there is one clear, steady quality sitting underneath it. When Scott believed someone had truly earned his respect, he tended to stay loyal to that person for years and years, sometimes for the rest of his career, no matter how much time had passed or how much had changed around them both.